Welcome back to another King study. We're going to be covering, again, three this evening. King Elah, King Zimri, and King Omri. We're going to jump right in with King Elah. King Elah was the son of Baasha, the king of Israel, who succeeded the house of Jeroboam after his assassination by Baasha. Elah's reign is notably brief, lasting only 2 years, and that was covered in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 8. Despite this short reign, it serves as a significant illustration of the ongoing spiritual and moral decline in the northern kingdom of Israel. His story also highlights God's judgment on the kings who continued the sinful practices of idolatry that had plagued Israel since its division. First, we look at Elah's ascension to the throne, which takes place in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 8. Elah became king after the death of his father, previously noted, Baasha. The Bible tells us that Elah's reign lasted for just 2 years, during which time he continued to walk in the evil ways of his father and grandfather, Jeroboam. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 8 in your King James Bible, it reads, "In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Elah, the son of Baasha, to reign over Israel in Tirzah, and reigned 2 years." Elah's ascension to the throne did not represent any change in direction for Israel. You would hope it would have, but it did not. His reign was a continuation of the sinful practices established by his father, Baasha, particularly the idolatry that was instituted by King Jeroboam the first. The second thing we look at is Elah's wickedness. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 13, it goes through all of this. And like his father, Elah followed in the idolatrous footsteps of Jeroboam and perpetuated the spiritual corruption that had taken root in the northern kingdom. The Bible notes that Elah did evil in the sight of the Lord and continued in the sin of idolatry. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 13, it reads, "For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, by which they sinned, and by which they made Israel to sin, in provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities." Both Baasha and Elah are described as having provoked God to anger because of their idolatrous practices. The vanities referred to here likely points to the false gods and idols that the kings of Israel promoted, particularly the golden calves at Bethel and Dan, which had been set up by Jeroboam. These acts of idolatry were deeply offensive to God and resulted in his judgment against the northern kingdom. In chapter 3, we look at, did I say chapter 3? I didn't mean chapter 3. I meant to say the third thing I would like to look at is Elah's downfall. Elah's reign was cut short due to a military coup led by a man named Zimri, one of Elah's servants. Zimri assassinated Elah while he was drunk and in his chamber. The violent end was a direct consequence of the unstable nature of Israel's political landscape during this time. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 9 and 10, and it reads, "And his servant Zimri, captain of half his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arzah, which had the charge of the house in Tirzah. And Zimri went in and smote him, and killed him, in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his stead." Zimri's action of assassinating Elah was both a power grab and a fulfillment of God's judgment on Elah's house. As God had pronounced judgment on Baasha's dynasty for continuing in the sins of Jeroboam, which was covered in 1 Kings chapter 16, 1 through 4, the fact that Elah was drunk when killed highlights the instability and moral decay of his leadership. Next thing I want to look at is God's judgment and fulfillment of prophecy. The assassination of Elah was not only a result of political instability, but also the fulfillment of God's judgment on the house of Baasha. God had foretold that the house of Baasha would be destroyed because of its wickedness and the sins it had committed, particularly the sin of leading Israel into idolatry. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 11 and 12, it reads, "And it came to pass, when he began to reign, as soon as he sat on his throne, that he slew all the house of Baasha. He left him not one that pisseth against the wall, neither of his kinsfolk, nor of his friends." Zimri's massacre of all of Baasha's family fulfilled God's earlier judgment on Baasha's house, which was covered in 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 29 and 30. This destruction was a consequence of their sins, especially leading Israel into idolatry. So what would Elah's legacy and spiritual lessons be? One, we can look at the continuation of Israel's decline. Elah's reign marks another brief, unremarkable chapter in the history of Israel's kings. Like his father Baasha, Elah followed the idolatrous path laid down by Jeroboam and perpetuated the spiritual decline of Israel. His failure to turn the nation toward true worship led to his downfall. Elah's death while drunk clearly highlights the foolishness and unpreparedness of his leadership. The Bible often associates drunkenness with moral failure, lack of self-control, and vulnerability to sin. Elah's demise serves as a tragic reminder that a lack of spiritual vigilance can lead to destructive consequences. Elah's reign and sudden assassination illustrates the ongoing principle of divine justice. While God allowed Baasha's dynasty to last for a time, the continued idolatry of Baasha and Elah led to the fulfillment of God's judgment. No ruler, no matter how powerful, can escape God's moral law. Just as Elah's house was cut off, so too did every dynasty that failed to lead Israel in righteousness face God's wrath. The fact that Zimri could overthrow Elah so quickly points to the instability and moral corruption within Israel's leadership. This political upheaval is not only a reflection of human ambition and power struggles, but also a sign of God's judgment on the corrupt monarchy of that time. When a nation is led by sinful rulers, the whole kingdom suffers instability and turmoil. Elah's reign, although short-lived, provides valuable lessons about the consequences of idolatry. the moral decay of Israel's leadership, and the fulfillment of divine judgment. Elah's assassination by Zimri serves as a reminder that the pride and sin of kings lead to their downfall. As with other kings in Israel, Elah did not lead his people toward God, but rather continued in the sinful footsteps of his ancestors. His reign ended in violence and bloodshed, fulfilling God's judgment on his house and reinforcing the biblical truth that idolatry and sin cannot go unpunished. Elah's legacy, therefore, is one of warning, dire warning, a reminder to leaders and nations alike that they must heed God's commands or face his judgment. Next, we get into King Zimri. King Zimri was one of the most fleeting and tragic figures in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel. His reign lasted only 7 days, and it ended in a violent and non-noble death. His brief time on the throne illustrates themes of political instability, divine judgment, and the consequences of treason and sin. Despite his short reign, the Bible does record the significant events surrounding Zimri's rise and fall, offering important lessons about leadership again and the consequences again of sin. Zimri was originally a captain of half the chariots under King Elah. But Elah, the king of Israel, was assassinated by Zimri while he was in the previous mentioned drunken stupor in the house of Arza. The act of this assassination was part of Zimri's political ambition, and he seized the throne immediately after King Elah. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 9 and 10, it reads, "And his servant Zimri, captain of half his chariots, conspired against him, as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, which had the charge of the house in Tirzah. And Zimri went in and smote him, and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his stead." Zimri's rise to the throne was violent, and it was marked by treason. The Bible specifically mentions that Elah was drunk when Zimri killed him, because it did highlight the moral decay and vulnerability of Elah's leadership at the time. When we look at Zimri's brief reign, it was a reign of insecurity. Zimri, having killed Elah, immediately began his reign, but his hold on power was fragile and unstable. Zimri was not universally supported, and his coup immediately caused unrest in Israel. The army, which was out on campaign, responded rather quickly to Zimri's actions and began to make preparations to return and confront him. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 11 and 12, and it reads, "And it came to pass, when he began to reign, as soon as he sat on his throne, that he slew all the house of Baasha. He left him not one that pisseth against the wall, neither of his kinfolk nor of his friends." King Zimri did not stop at simply killing Elah. He also ordered the destruction of the entire house of Baasha, just as Baasha had previously wiped out the descendants of Jeroboam. This act fulfilled God's earlier prophecy of judgment on the house of Baasha for their idolatry. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 13 through 15, and it reads, For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, by which they sinned, and by which they made Israel to sin, and provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities. And Zimri reigned 7 days in Tirzah. Zimri's reign lasted 7 days. Not 1 day less, not 1 day more. And his act of killing the house of Baasha demonstrates that, like previous kings, he was deeply entrenched in the cycle of sin and violence. The brief reign is a reminder that political instability and violence do not bring peace or stability to a kingdom, but rather lead to turmoil and eventual downfall. Zimri's rule quickly came to an end due to the military opposition led by Omri, the commander of the army, who had been away fighting the Philistines. Upon hearing of Elah's assassination and Zimri's claim to the throne, Omri and the army marched back to Tirzah, the capital, to confront Zimri. Zimri, realizing that he had lost the support of the people and the army, fled to the palace. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 16 through 18, and it reads, "But the people that were encamped heard say, Zimri hath conspired and hath also slain the king. Wherefore all Israel made Omri, the captain of the host, king over Israel that day in the camp. And Omri went up from Gibbethon, and all Israel with him, and they besieged Tirzah." Zimri's support clearly and obviously quickly evaporated as Omri was proclaimed king of the army, and the people of Israel rallied behind him. Zimri's position grew more precarious as the army closed in on Tirzah, faced with certain defeat. Zimri took the drastic step of setting the palace on fire, committing suicide by burning himself alive. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 18 through 19, "And it came to pass, when Zimri saw that the city was taken, that he went into the palace of the king's house and burnt the king's house over him with fire, and died. For his sins which he sinned in doing evil in the sight of the Lord, in walking in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin which he did to make Israel to sin." Zimri's violent death by fire marked a tragic end to his brief reign. His failure to maintain any genuine support and the lack of legitimacy in his rule led to his abandonment and ultimate self-destruction. His actions fulfill the cycle of destruction that often accompanies those who seize power through treason and violence, because the same thing happens every time. The result hardly ever changes. Take a quick look at God's judgment on Zimri. Zimri's reign, like those of many of the kings of Israel, was marked by sin, particularly idolatry. Zimri, like Jeroboam and Baasha before him, led Israel in the sin of idol worship, specifically the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. The Bible records that Zimri's reign was characterized by the same evil and sinful practices that had plagued Israel's leadership for generations. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 19, and it reads, "For his sins which he sinned in doing evil in the sight of the Lord, in walking in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin which he did to make Israel to sin." King Zimri's actions and their consequences reflect God's judgment on those who lead the people into sin. Even though King Zimri's reign was short, it served as a reminder that the cycle of idolatry and sin in Israel would not go unpunished. His downfall is an example of how sin and unrighteousness will ultimately bring destruction to those who engage in it. A few things we can learn from King Zimri's legacy, a few lessons, so to speak, one being the political instability. King Zimri's brief reign highlighted the fragility of power gained through violence and treason. His assassination of King Elah led to a short lived reign and even a quicker downfall. This underscores the idea that leadership based on treachery and treason and deception is inherently unstable and cannot endure in the long term. Deceivers of deception will always be shown. We look at God's judgment. King Zimri's demise shows that those who engage in wickedness and lead others into sin will ultimately face God's judgment. His death by fire serves as a symbol of the fiery judgment that awaits those who reject God's ways and live in rebellion against him. King Zimri's reign exemplifies the ongoing cycle of sin in Israel, particularly the perpetuation, the continuation of idolatry and evil practices. Despite the briefness of his reign, it was still marked by the same sins that had characterized the kings before him. Learning from history was not a thing, I guess. And this cycle would continue until Israel's eventual exile. King Zimri's reign was marked, as we said before, by violence, political instability, and sin. His treasonous acts of assassinating King Elah led to his brief and tragic rule. King Zimri's reign did end in self-destruction as he committed suicide by fire when confronted by Omri and the army. His death served as the fulfillment of God's judgment on the house of Baasha, and his actions contributed to the continuing decline of Israel's monarchy. King Zimri's story is a reminder of the consequences of sin, the fragility of power obtained through treachery, and the inevitability of divine judgment for those who lead others into sin, which we can learn as today in our life. And finally, we get to King Omri. King Omri was the sixth king of Israel after the division of the kingdom, and his reign was marked by significant political intrigue, military successes, and the continuation of idolatry. Although Omri's reign is often overshadowed by the latter reign of his son Ahab, Omri's political and military achievements were significant in consolidating the northern kingdom of Israel and establishing a legacy that had lasting effects on the nation. However, his reign also reinforced Israel's spiritual decline through the continued idolatry. King Omri became king of Israel following the short and violent reign of the previous king, King Zimri, who had been, or I should say, who did assassinate King Elah. After Zimri's suicide, the army of Israel proclaimed Omri as king, and he quickly marched to take the throne in Tirzah, the capital city of Israel at that time. Omri's rise to power was marked by political unrest, but he eventually secured his position. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 15 through 17, and it reads, "In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, did Omri begin to reign over Israel, and reigned 12 years. 6 years reigned he in Tirzah. And he bought the hill Samaria of Shemer for 2 talents of silver, and built on the hill, and called the name of the city which he built after the name of Shemer, owner of the hill, Samaria. Omri's rise to power was not without conflict. Tibni, another claimant to the throne, contested Omri's rule, leading to a period of civil war. Omri, however, prevailed after several years of fighting and consolidating his power. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became the undisputed king of Israel. One of King Omri's most notable achievements was the establishment of the new capital city of Samaria on the hill he purchased from that man named Shemer. Said city would become the political and cultural center of Israel, and Samaria would later give its name to the entire northern kingdom. The foundation of Samaria helped to solidify Omri's legacy as a strong and successful ruler, which leads to our next conversation of his reign and political stability. As I said before, Omri's reign lasted 12 years. And during this time, he was able to bring a measure of political stability to Israel. He successfully consolidated power and secured the northern kingdom's position among neighboring nations. This stability, was important after the turmoil of Zimri and Tibni's brief reigns. However, Omri's reign is often viewed as a time of continued moral and spiritual decline, despite his political success. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 23, and it reads, "In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, began Omri to reign over Israel, and reigned 12 years. 6 years reigned in Tirzah." While King Omri brought stability to Israel, the Bible also describes his reign as one marked by the continuation, as many of the others, of idolatry and wickedness. His success did not change Israel's underlying spiritual decline, which would, as we said before, continue to have dire consequences. Next, we get into Omri's idolatry and wickedness. Omri is remembered not only for his political and military achievements, but also for his idolatry and the evil he did in the eyes of God. The Bible makes it clear that Omri continued in the sinful ways of previous kings, especially those of Jeroboam. He led Israel further into idolatry, which was the primary sin of the northern kingdom. First Kings chapter 16, verses 25 and 26, it reads, "But Omri wrought evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did worse than all that were before him. For he walked in all the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin, to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities." Omri's reign was marked by a deepening, or I should say marked a deepening of Israel's idolatry. The golden calves at Bethel and Dan, which were originally set up by Jeroboam, continued to be the central form of worship in the northern kingdom. Omri's promotion of this sinful worship led Israel further away from the true God. The Bible emphasizes that Omri did worse than all that were before him, signifying that although he was a politically successful king, he was spiritually worse than his predecessors. His reign thus exemplified how political power and success can coexist with deep spiritual failure. That's a coexist you don't want to have. King Omri's reign was significant in terms of both his military and his political legacy. While he is often remembered for his idolatry, his ability to establish Samaria as a strong and enduring capital city of Israel was one of his most notable achievements. Despite his wickedness, Samaria became a symbol of Omri's leadership. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 27 and 28, and it reads, "Now the rest of the acts of Omri which he did, and his might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers, and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son reigned in his stead." Omri's military might was also notable. During his reign, he successfully defended Israel against the growing power of neighboring nations at that time, which further strengthened his rule. Although the Bible does not provide details on all of his military campaigns, his legacy was strong enough to ensure that his son Ahab succeeded him on the throne. Despite Omri's political and military successes, his reign was or would set the stage for even greater spiritual decline that would occur under Ahab. Ahab, who later married the notorious Jezebel, would continue in his father's footsteps by promoting even greater idolatry and wickedness, leading Israel further into sin. In fact, Omri is mentioned in other extra biblical sources. The Moabite stone records a reference to him as well. God's judgment on Omri's house. I think that's how we're going to end this. The Bible's portrayal of Omri's reign emphasizes his wickedness and idolatry, and this would have lasting consequences for his dynasty. While Omri himself was not directly punished by God within the time of his reign, the judgment for his sins would come through the actions of his son Ahab and the future kings of Israel. Omri's actions were part of the continuing downward spiral of Israel's kings, a spiral that would ultimately lead to Israel's destruction in the future. King Omri's reign was a paradox of political success and spiritual failure. On the one hand, Omri established a strong and enduring kingdom founded by the new capital in Samaria and secured Israel's position among the nations. On the other hand, he continued in the wicked ways of his predecessors, leading Israel further into idolatry and provoking God's anger. King Omri's military prowess and political stability were overshadowed, as they often are, by his moral and spiritual failure, setting the stage for even worse kings, most notably his son Ahab, whose reign would be marked by even greater idolatry and evil. And we will definitely be getting to that. The story of Omri responds to many fears, but the story of Omri reminds readers that even though he had these material successes and political stability, they were not sufficient when it came to the cost of spiritual faithfulness. King Omri's legacy serves as another cautionary tale about the consequences of leading a nation into sin and the inevitable judgment that follows. Thank you for tuning in to another King study, and I hope to see you the next time. God bless.